Hey there, today I decided to check some of the most amazing queen sacrifices that former world champion Mikhail Tal played throughout his career. And some of the sacrifices that we'll see are pretty straightforward, where after the sacrifice, Tal forces a fairly direct win, but we're also going to see other sacrifices that involve deeper ideas and long-term compensation. So without further ado, let's start with the first one. So here the positions are going to be quite insane. White sacrificed two minor pieces for a bunch of pawns. Black has these two extra knights, but on the other hand, these two pawns are restricting Black's pieces a lot. And this is another common pattern that I saw in Tal's games. Very often he would tide his opponent pieces down. So here Black has to be very careful about this pawn promoting. The queen is very important here, guarding the back rank. So here Black is pretty much one move away from consolidating. White would love to play something like knight d to f6, where these two knights would be defending each other, and White seems to be running out of ideas. And in fact in this position, White doesn't have any sensible check to attack Black, but here Tal found the very nice queen takes e4. So this queen on a8 was actually a bit overloaded because it was defending the knight, and after queen takes, Black doesn't have anything better. Now White can give a check on the 8 and then promote the pawn. Tal still had to see many moves in advance. He was definitely a great calculator. So here after king to f7, White promotes, and the queen and the rook will combine very well to attack Black's king. So here after king to f6, rook to d6, king to f5. This is pretty much forced, and after queen to g6 and king to f4, now Tal played g3, and the king has to keep an eye on the queen. That's why Tal played king to e3, but after rook to d3, the idea is to drive the king to the second rank in order to capture the queen on e4. Here Black gave the queen and actually immediately resigned. The point is that after queen takes, now White gets the material advantage and these two very strong pass pawns, so it's just a matter of converting this advantage. And before we move on to the next queen sacrifice, let me ask you how you would play in this position. This is another game by Tal. In this position he played a very nice queen move in order to force his opponent to resign. So what did Tal play in this position? Let me know in the comments. So here in this next position, we have a typical Tal position where a lot of pieces are under attack, and Tal very often took a lot of risks himself, because here the king on c1 can actually be checked. So in this position, the queen on h5 is actually being attacked. This knight on h6 could potentially be captured by a pawn on g7, and here most of us would probably try to move the queen, for example, to h4, but in this position, this would allow Black to continue developing the pieces, which is the main drawback in this position. Black still has to connect the rooks, and after that, Black will be doing great and be ready to attack White. Here White could try something creative like rook takes d8 and then take on f6, but again the problem is that White's king is exposed because after queen to a1 we actually get a checkmate. But here again, out of nowhere, Tal played the very brilliant queen takes f7, sacrificing the queen, and the idea is to get a background checkmate after rook takes and rook takes d8. Black doesn't have anything better than to give material, but White still gets a checkmate. But again, White has to be careful about queen to a1 ideas, which is what Smyslov played in this position. And after king to d2, now we don't get the idea of capturing on the 8 because the king is blocking the rook. But on the other hand, White is now attacking the queen on a1. So here Black took on f7, and after knight takes, king to g8, and rook takes, after all these trades, White ends up being an exchange up, and in fact after knight to e5, White picked up another pawn and won in just a few moves. So here after king to e6, knight takes, knight to e4, king to e3, bishop to b6 and bishop to d4, Black had enough and resigned. Now let's move on to another queen sacrifice, which is much more of a positional sacrifice because Black here doesn't get a forcing win or a forcing attack. So here in this position, White is offering a trade of queens, which Black actually cannot go for because after queen takes e2, White has the intermediate move, knight takes e7, giving a check and capturing a pawn, and then White will happily take on d2. So black has to keep an eye on this pawn, and after the move queen to d8, defending on e7, white has a very comfortable position after taking on f6, and then there's a lot of pressure on c5. For example, after bishop takes f6, white can take on c5, and after pawn takes, we see that this knight on d7 is pinned, so white could even take on c5, although black might take on c4 in that case, or even knight to c3, and we see that white seems to be the one having pressure in this position. Maybe this position can be playable and holdable for black, but here we see another skill that Tal had, which was his fighting spirit. And in this position, he played the very creative knight takes d5. So sacrificing the queen, which white took, white could have taken on d5, and the position would be fairly balanced. But taking the queen here is actually way too tempting, and the idea is that after knight takes c3, black is getting 2 minor pieces so far, but there's the idea to attack the rook and the pawn on c4. So here after rook to c1, knight takes c4, and now black is attacking the queen, and in this position if the queen moves, for example, to e1, now black can take on d4, and black is actually collecting some material for the queen, 2 minor pieces plus 2 pawns, and black's pieces will get active very quickly, so this position even seems easier to play as black. And instead white decided to take on c4, but after b takes c4, now the material balance is pretty much restored. Black got a rook, a bishop and a pawn for the queen, so black's position is already preferable, because black will also get pressure on the b file. So the game continued knight to c1, and after rook to b8, bishop takes, knight to b6, bishop to b3 and bishop takes c4. This position is definitely easier to play as black. Black has an easy plan to attack on the queen side. After queen to d2, bishop to g7, knight to e2, c4, bishop to c2, Tal played nice c3, with the idea to go knight to c4, attacking the queen and the pawn on b4. White tried queen to d3, but after c takes b2, now this pawn is going to be very strong. White tried knight to d4, and after bishop to d7, rook to d1, black brought another piece, so the game ended in just a few moves. Rook to c3, queen takes a6, and here black found a forcing way to convert the advantage after bishop takes, pawn takes, rook b to c8, with the idea to go rook to c1. White is in no time to take on b2, because after rook 3 to c6, we attack the queen and we give a check, so black is collecting the queen. And after queen to a3, rook to c1, rook takes and rook takes, here white resigned because black is ready to promote the p-pawn. And before we move on to the next game, as we saw, an important part of becoming a great player is to improve as a chess player overall, not only at tactics but also understanding the game in the long term. And to help you here, I have a free course that will provide you with a daily improvement plan. So feel free to check the course in the description. So here we have again a very wild position, but white seems to be in trouble at first sight because black has a lot of pieces under attack, and in this position Tal found a very creative move. So this example is probably not that accurate, but on the other hand it shows how creative Tal could be in pretty much any position. Because here white had a way to continue, which is queen to b3, at least a more solid way. The idea is to go knight to d6, forking the king and the bishop, and if black captures on c4, white gets the idea of taking on b7, attacking the rook. So this would be probably a solid way to hold the balance. But instead Tal found a very creative way to continue, which is e takes f6, sacrificing the queen. And actually, since a lot of white's pieces are loose here, black even had a very creative way to continue, which is to castle short. Because even though black is temporarily a piece down, now black is ready to capture some material back. But instead, black took the queen. It's very hard to blame black for that. And after pawn takes g7, rook to g8. So far white only gets a minor piece for the queen, so in this position playing something like rook f to e1 wouldn't be a good idea, because even though white gets the queen back, now black is happily ready to give it. After taking on h4 and then taking on e6, black is happy because all these trades will favor him, even though white gets this fork on d6, and then taking on b7, black will capture this pawn on g7, and in the end, black is an exchange up. But here Tal found the shocking move bishop to f5, so out of nowhere there's the idea to attack the king on e8. And again, a lot of white spaces are loose in this position, but let's try to understand what is going on here. One idea is that if black captures the bishop on f5 after knight to d6, white is getting the material back. The queen cannot stay on the e file because after a move like queen to e2, knight to d6 is a very nice checkmate. Or if the queen captures the knight on c4, then after rook f to e1, we get this attack against the king. Black could still try queen to e6, but white still gets the attack after taking on e6 and then taking the knight. The king can escape to d7. Here the move bishop to f6, protecting this very strong pawn, would be good, but white could even continue attacking with the move rook to d1. And after king to c7, bishop to g3 is very strong. If the king goes to b6, rook to b1 will continue attacking the king. And after king to c8, white has this very nice move, bishop to f7, attacking the rook and the pawn e6. And after rook takes and bishop takes, black doesn't have anything better than to go rook to d7, and white is collecting material and continuing with the attack. But black defended quite tenaciously in this position and went knight takes h4. And after bishop takes, the idea is that after pawn takes, knight to d6 will fork the king and the bishop. But here black tried the very creative bishop to a6, capturing the knight if the bishop on e6 moves. But again Tal found a very creative move, knight to d6, and after king to e7, bishop to c4, counterattacking the bishop on e6. So here after rook takes, g3, king takes, and bishop takes. After all this mess, we got a fairly balanced position, so even though this sacrifice was very nice, it was enough to complicate the game, but black managed to find very accurate moves, and in this position these pawns are actually quite bad. So white has a better pawn structure, and white is ready to activate the rooks, so this position is even preferable for white to play, so Tal managed to even win the game. And the last position is a great example of how effective forcing moves can be. So as usual we have a crazy position, white gave a few pawns trying to attack this king on f8. Now this queen on e5 is under attack, so here most of us would probably move the queen or even take on d4, looks like a very reasonable option. Another move that looks very attractive here is rook d to f1, pinning the pawn and bringing another piece to attack the king. But moving the queen to any square would not be a good idea. For example, after queen to f4, black can go queen to d6, inviting a trade of queens and getting ready to develop. So black might have hopes in this position. But instead of moving the queen, Tal played the forcing move rook takes g7, and again we get this craziness. Both the queen and the rook can be captured. If the rook is captured, then after rook to g1, white is ready to combine an attack against the king after queen to g3. So here if the king goes to h6, then after queen to f4, white can even sacrifice this bishop. We can see that this king is very badly placed. For example, after queen to f3, king to h6, and queen to g3, we're ready to give a checkmate on h4. And after f5, covering h4, white can go queen to g7 and then bring another attacker, knight to f4. And after king to h4, we can give a checkmate on h6 or by going queen to g3. Similarly, after king to f8, queen to g3 is very strong, planning to go queen to g7. The only move I can think of to continue the game here is to go bishop takes b4, which gives the check. And here white can simply take on b4. Moving the king is also an option, but just taking bishop and getting ready to invade is good enough. And if the queen tries to cover g7, now we can bring back the knight, attacking the queen and the pawn. And after something like queen to d7, we even have the additional idea of going queen to a3, so white is given a checkmate. So instead here black took the queen on e5, and now after rook to f7, these two rooks will combine to attack the king. Here black tried king to e8, if the king goes to g8, we can simply take on e7, queen takes is the only move, and here we could take on e7, but even simpler is to go rook to g1 and then force a checkmate after queen to g5 and rook takes g5. So here after rook to f7, king to e8, white's idea is to take on e7, giving a check, and after king to f8, rook to f1, king to g8. In this position, Tal actually had a forced mate in two moves by going knight to f6 and rook to f7. But again, since black's pieces are completely tied down, white even improved this rook on f1 and went rook f to f7, and in this position black resigned because there's still the idea to go knight to f6, in this case given a checkmate, and if black goes queen to d6, white can force a checkmate after rook to e8, queen to f8, and then taking on f8. So I hope that you enjoyed these very wild games and that you might get some inspiration for your future attacks. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.